I'm going to talk about how we could use some ideas from Swedenborg, because we saw in the last talk how Swedenborg appears several times as sources of ideas. I want to talk about how Swedenborg was a source of ideas in my own life of ideas. And so, for those who are interested, our Theistic Science group has a website there, theisticscience.com. So if I find them out, I can do this, can't I? Which way? Okay. So I'm going to talk about finding Swedenborg's ideas that solve problems in science, because I've been interested in science for a long time. And I'm going to talk about two parts of my talk. The first part is a physics problem, and the second part is a psychology problem. The physics problem is, what is the substance of things if you have quantum physics? Because we'll see how quantum physics is puzzling to very many people. And so we want to begin to get an answer to help solve the puzzles. And the second problem is, a lot of people talk about stages of development in adults, from childhood to adult. And Piaget, Erickson, and many others have suggested stages. So what are these stages? How do they work? And what do they do? So the first problem is, my story is that I was very puzzled by mind-body problem and religion and physics when I was in my late 20s. And then when I discovered Swedenborg when I was about 20 in New Zealand at the time, because I was reading Wilson Van Dusen's book, The Presence of Spirits and Madness. And he goes on to talk about good spirits, and he references Swedenborg. So I started reading Swedenborg a lot, and I was reading Swedenborg while simultaneously trying to understand about quantum physics. That was my professional life. I was doing a Ph.D. in nuclear physics, and that was my job in nuclear reaction theory for much of my life, although I retired last year. So the point is that I was looking for a common ground to combine quantum physics and Swedenborg. And so my question that I was trying to answer was, what is the world like such that we have both Swedenborg true and quantum theory true? We have to try and get some idea of what the world is. So, as I said, the physics problem was, what is the substance of things given quantum physics? Because if you look at particle physics, you look at quantum physics, they talk about particles, they talk about waves, they talk about events, they talk about observations, they talk about qualities, mass and charge, and these things, but they don't really know what are things really made of in quantum physics. This is the challenge. And to work out what they're made of, I looked at the question of what is it that persists over a finite time interval. Because the word substance has been used, has many different definitions. So Webster gives the substance as the ultimate reality of that which underlies in our manifestation and change. So that's a very general definition. A substance, according to Descartes, is that whose existence is independent of anything else. But these definitions, these definitions could be satisfied by God. There's something very deep about these two definitions. So I'm trying to answer a more specific question, as I said, what is it persists over time, or what is the being or the essay, as Swedenborg describes, of things? So, and I want to talk about what it is for finite substances. I want to talk about atoms, I want to talk about molecules or light. And so we want to, and that's what quantum physics tries to describe. Quantum physics is a problem that we've had for 100 years. We want to ask, what is the world made of such that quantum theory could be a true theory? And many answers have been suggested. We can have waves, a shape, a form, an event, a particle, or energy, or experimental result, or potentiality, or actuality, or perhaps mind is responsible for producing, or propensity. All of these ideas have been proposed over the last 100 years of people trying to understand quantum physics. The mathematics of quantum physics seems straightforward, and it can make predictions of probability. So is probability something that it's made out of? So we're not really sure. There's still a puzzle. And so when we look at quantum physics, I want to remind you why it's a problem. Because we have waves in quantum physics, but classical waves and quantum waves behave quite differently. A classical wave is like a sound waves going out in the air, or a wave on an ocean, or waves and vibrations in a solid. But as these waves spread out, they affect everywhere where the wave is. So that the wave actually is at all the different places. But a quantum wave, like an electron or a light or a photon, affects only one place where the wave has its final effect. This is called the reduction of the wave packet. You start off with a spread out wave, but if this is an electron going on a photographic plate, it ends up localized. Only one atom can be, one photographic grain can be triggered by a single electron. You need lots of electrons in order to trigger multiple things. So the quantum waves are really quite different from classical waves. Classical waves are actually everywhere, but quantum waves are sort of a spread out set of possibilities, only one of which gets selected. So and when it's selected, it looks like there's a particle being revealed, but there wasn't a particle when it was spread out. So there's a lot of puzzles about what's going on. Now you might say the shape of the wave changes, but the shape is just the form, it's not the substance. So we need to understand better what's going on here. And so it's natural to ask, what is a quantum substance? And as I said, there are waves, particles, measurement events, etc. But these measurements are like a change in which some potential which is spread out goes to an actual, and Aristotle was very keen on discussing how potentiality and powers produce actual events. But the question is, what is potential and what is actual? Now, Karl Popper, 100 years ago, suggested the idea of propensity, which is what is potential that it exists before giving an actual result according to some probability. So this word propensity is an idea that seems to explain what quantum things are made of, but we still don't really know what a propensity is. Is it a property? Is it a form? Is it a substance? We're not sure. And in trying to understand that, I was simultaneously reading Swedenborg. And we read in Swedenborg from Divine Love and Wisdom that love is the life of all creatures. It's the essence and being of all. Not only God is the essence and being of all, love is the essence and being of God, but you can have finite creatures, finite things. Because we heard earlier, Divine Love and Wisdom 53, I just want to read the first sentence. Things created and finite can have ascribed to them being and expression, a substance and form, etc. So we can see here that finite things have substance and form, or being, esse and existere, as well as God. So if we go back to what quantum things are, then we go back to what Swedenborg says about love. So love is in a mind, a child, an adult, a spiritual being, or even an insect has desires, or a frog has desires. Every animal, and you can actually see some kind of desires in single-cell living creatures. They have a desire to follow to where food is. So every living thing has love in it in an important way. But the thing is that Swedenborg says that love is like the substance of things. And we understand for spiritual things that love is the substance, but now we have the idea that love is what necessarily persists over an interval of time. The reason that love does this is that love is something that happens now, something that exists now, that wants to create an effect in the future. And so therefore, love has to be whatever it is that persists over time. And so we feel the desire now, and we think about how and when to act, and then we act at a later time. So that Swedenborg gives me the idea that love is like the substance of things, okay? At least of spiritual things. So, as I say, love is the substance in the sense of having a form and persisting over time, and the form is something else, but love is the substance itself. So from Swedenborg, I read, when I was 20, 22, whatever, that love is a substance, and I was trying at the same time to understand what is the substance of quantum things. And then you get the idea that perhaps whatever the answer to those questions have to correspond to each other, that love of spiritual things has to correspond as a substance to whatever the substance is of quantum things, because we know the natural world, the physical world, is made out of quantum things. So the challenge was to connect those together. So this was my burning bush, so to speak. It's an example of how I got some ideas from Swedenborg which tried to answer a problem in physics. And the understanding is to see that love and Swedenborg, when compared with propensity in physics, I realized that they correspond to each other. So Swedenborg's concept of love is very similar to the concept of propensity used in the physics of probabilities. They correspond to each other because both are what exist in some interval over some interval of time. Both have form as well as substance, and they both produce specific discrete actions or selections after some interval of time. So, if love is the substance of spiritual things, then by correspondences, propensity, which is the physical version of love, is the substance of physical things. So I began to have an answer of how to have an idea of what substance of quantum things was, such that it did all those strange things that quantum physics objects do. So I began to see how both of these must be the initial being that produces the final results. So we know from Parmenides, if you remember your Greek philosophy, Parmenides says that everything is being and everything has to remain being. So being and Aristotle showed that beings can transform from one form to another, but they still remain being. And so love from Swedenborg the love of finite objects comes from the love of God. So that means the being of God produces the being of finite objects, finite spiritual beings, and then the being of finite spiritual beings then produces the actions. So the actions have being as well. So the being flows continuously without break through these discrete degrees. And this agrees with what Aristotle says about being transformed from one to another, and it actually agrees with Parmenides when he said that whatever has being has to remain being, because that's what being does, that's what being is. So we see that this is the reason for the fact that there are correspondences between God and spiritual things and physical things, because the being is transformed, it remains some kind of being. One derives from the other. But the point is that we can see that the being of spiritual things, which is love, corresponds and is very similar to the propensity idea that some people have proposed for physics. And the fact that they've proposed it means we can begin to see how the propensity in physics is the substance of physical things. So if we carry on. So what I can do now is to take this idea of propensity, which was proposed for physics, but we see that it corresponds to love. And that means it behaves in the same way as love, although the substance, the actions are quite different. So propensity can be taken as a general concept. You can have physical propensities, you can have mental propensities, you can have spiritual propensities, which is love, and mental propensities will be desire, and physical propensities can be force or something like that. So you can have force and desire and love, and even divine love can be all taken as the category of propensity applied at different discrete degrees. So they differ. These ideas of these different forms of propensity are different substances. They vary according to their interaction and what they produce. And the result is that we also get an idea of mental substance in the middle here, which is mental propensities. In other words, something that persists over time, it explores different possibilities, and then it produces a specific effect. That's what our desires are. Our desires are something that's going to produce an effect. It uses our understanding to explore the different possibilities, and then it produces a specific result when we decide what we want to do. So that corresponds to quantum substances. Quantum substances are like, a quantum substance is a being, and first of all, it explores different possibilities, like a wave spreading out, and then it interacts with, say, a photographic plate, and only one grain gets exposed from each electron, and so the waves being spread out is like exploring different possibilities with different probable numbers, and one of them is selected, and it's a specific action. So we see the same corresponding processes, but at different discrete degrees, and we can see from Swedenborg saying that love in the spiritual world is the substance of things, we can see that propensity in the physical world is the substance of physical things. So we get a new understanding of propensity in such a way that it tells us something about physics. We could say what physical things, what quantum things are made of. What's the substance? The substance is propensity. It's something that lasts over a finite interval of time at least, and it explores different possibilities, and then it selects one and gives a definite result. And that's what quantum objects do. That's what mental objects do, minds, natural minds, and it's what spiritual objects do as well. And if you want to, you can think of God choosing how to create the world. He's doing something similar again, because these all correspond to each other. So if I remember what my next, yes. So the next, that's half my talk, okay? This is using the idea from Swedenborg that because I saw that love is a substance and love corresponds to physical propensities, and therefore we can say that physical propensities are substances as well. So the second half of my talk is the psychology problem, okay? I call it a psychology problem, but I was very interested in trying to understand how the mind works. I first of all started with trying to understand how computers could imitate the mind, but so the question is, there are levels of development in children and adults. What are they? What are these levels? As I said, a variety of people have suggested stages or levels, because that's what they've observed, and we can see what they are. And then reading Swedenborg at the same time, Sweden talks about discrete degrees based on love, wisdom, and use. So this pattern of love, wisdom, and use is going to be everywhere, and I'm going to use those ideas to try and understand what these levels of development are that were proposed by these people and others. So we want to look at some of the historical ideas. Some of these are rather early ideas, but they're very useful because they can describe what happens in the different stages. Some of the previous speakers have talked about what happens at various ages. And we can see some of the reasons for that. So the earliest ones was Jean Piaget, who looked at cognitive stages in children, a sensory motor stage when they're just exploring things, a pre-operational stage when they begin to organize their activities to do things, a concrete operations, which is when they can do things in forward and backwards, like pouring water. If you pour water from one cup to another, even if the bowl is a different shape, they could realize that the quantity of water is the same. There's conservation. So, and then we go to formal operations when you get older. When you're a teenager, you're interested in games and mathematics and reversible things as well, but you get a lot of into abstract ideas. And so I've just described a lot of these things here. So basic actions at the early age, and then beginning of symbolic thought in the pre-operational, and then we call conservation, reversibility, and classification. So this is an age here where you're very keen on collecting and classifying shells or stamps or whatever it is you like doing at that stage. And then formal operations where you have abstract thinking and logical reasoning and the ability to understand hypothetical concepts. So this is the 4 stages of Piaget. And Erik Erikson was another psychologist about the same time, looked at more psychosocial development in terms of feelings and desires. And he looked at the activities at different stages and what are the issues, the opposing issues, and the ages. And I'm not going to go into all the detail here, except to note that we can try and combine these with Piaget's. And a person called John Gowan tried to combine them. He modified Piaget by splitting one of the pre-operational stages, and he moves a few things around. And then Michael Lamport Commons was another psychologist who tried to have different extensions of Piaget. But I think of Piaget as looking at the thinking at each stage, and Erikson looking at the feeling at each stage. And we know from Swedenborg that thinking and feeling always go together. That if you have feeling, then there has to be a thinking about how the feelings do things. And if you have thinking, you have to have feelings in order to motivate the thinking. So they always go together. And so it would make sense for them to be combined. So this is Gowan's extensions, to combine them together. So we start with the bottom right, and we go 0 to 1, and then up to 4 to 6. So this is the infant, the first 3 infant stages of cognitive and emotional development. And then from age 7 up to 25, you have the formal operations, and then the stage 18 to 25, which is what Steve mentioned. Who was it mentioned? Okay, one person mentioned this morning about when they attach to fixed ideas at that stage. Anyway, so and then Erikson's stages went up to older ages, and so I was looking at this chart for a number of years until I realized that there's something important here that I should recognize once I know Swedenborg. Okay, how is this related to Swedenborg's ideas? So this was my burning bush moment for this chart in psychology. So these 3 columns correspond to 3 degrees of love, wisdom, and use. And the 3 rows also correspond to adult, youth, and infant, which also correspond to love, wisdom, and use, if you think about what these people are doing at each stage. So it took me a while to realize that, but once I did that, I could see, here's the chart again. So these 3 ages here, the sensual, the outer rational, the Ishmael rational, or the inner rational, the Isaac, So, and this inner layer is concerned with love, thinking about love and doing things from love and making sure that your love is organized in a proper way. This middle layer is concerned about thinking with ideas and starts off with thinking about actions, then thinking about thinking, and then thinking about love. And then this first stage is all about actions, the sort of thing that a child does up to about the age of 6. They first of all work out how to feel and act, and then they think about the particular things they can do, and then they want to know why, okay? They want to think about the purposes of all of these actions. And this is the stage where questions of why come up. And so you can see that these three layers are love, wisdom, and use. And then you can see that each column is also to do with love, understanding, and action. So once we think from Swedenborg that love, wisdom, and use are the three things that always have to be in an order like that, we can see them in many ways in this chart. And I was amazed to see these things, because we can, there are 3 degrees in the mental, okay? The table from Gowan, which is what I just showed, when you see it in the light from Swedenborg, shows that these threefold degrees are both in the columns and in the rows, okay? And I was very surprised when I realized what was happening there. So the point is that we can understand that we can use ideas of influx and degrees, which we learned from Swedenborg, divine love and wisdom in particular, and correspondences, to understand what's happening in the psychological degrees. We can understand that as children grow from infants into youth, and then from youth into adult, they are dealing with different things. They start off by dealing with actions, and then they think about recognizing actions, performing actions, and planning actions. And then they think about thoughts. They think about doing thoughts, and then forming thoughts, and then inventing new thoughts. And then when they get older, when they begin to have spiritual regeneration, that's the first day of creation, they realize that there's love, which they can think about as well. They can think about the actions of love. They can think about the means that love operates, and then they can work out what loves are and how they are motivated and selected. So to summarize again, so there are 3 degrees in these 3 rows, from childhood up to young adult to full adulthood. So red is for celestial, blue is for spiritual, green is for natural, in the obvious colors you might think. So these 3 degrees correspond to the 3 stages of focus of the mind and of the feelings. Of course, when you're in these stages, you're using all of these stages because you're already proficient in, whenever you get to a stage, you're proficient in all of the previous stages. And so you're building up the complexity of a mind. And so when you get to this stage, for instance, you have the ability to understand actions, the ability to understand planning and action of plans, and then you begin to actually make plans that are good, or actions of charity in order to do things. And so these are the 3 stages of human life. But you can see that at each stage, each row, there's also a combination of use and then or action and then thinking and then ends that are happening there. And so we begin to see that Swedenborg has love, wisdom, and use, but you can see that within love there are 3 degrees, and within wisdom there are 3 degrees, because you have to think about wisdom and do things. And then even within action there are 3 sub-degrees. And so we can begin to use these ideas to see the ideas of influx and degrees and correspondences. We learn from reading Swedenborg about how these are set up, and you can understand some of the basic steps of what happens in psychology. And in fact, okay, this is the end of the second part. Now I just want to say some things about where I went to after having these two understandings of, I learned something new from Swedenborg by seeing what he had, first of all about love being a substance, and secondly about how everything was love, wisdom and use, even in some degrees. And I used those two insights in order to understand something new in physics and in psychology. But then we want to go to a broader picture, because I'm just thinking, so far, I'm just thinking about mental, those 9 degrees that I showed were just in the mind, okay? But we know mind is one of 3 degrees, because all of these 9 degrees that I've described so far. Now I'm going to think of them from Swedenborg's point of view, because I know I'm just trying to demonstrate that this can be done. So take a particular degree here. So this 8. This is thoughts of means of love. So, or this one here is thoughts of means of action. So you can use what Swedenborg says that these 3 degrees do, and we can think about what's going on at each of these stages. So if I look at okay. So now, yes, so that was a summary of these 3 stages from Swedenborg's point of view. And now we come to how to, okay, so we've been talking about mental degrees. I said this came from understanding what psychologists were saying about the growth of the mind. And I call them mental degrees. Swedenborg calls these the spiritual and natural, or sometimes just natural. But the point is now that these should be connected with the other things that Swedenborg says are involved in the universe that he describes. There are spiritual heavens above this natural mind, and there are physical degrees below, or so to speak, to use a metaphor, below these mental degrees. And so we can try and put them into a bigger picture. And the way I put them into a bigger picture is to, again, use the fact that the 3 degrees that Swedenborg talks about can have sub-degrees. So here, this are the 3 rows that I talked about before. Thoughts of love, thoughts of thoughts, thoughts of actions. Those are the 3 rows. I've ignored the fact that there are sub-degrees here. I've just talked about these 3. But if you use Swedenborg's logic, you see that these are thoughts of love, what happens after you have a spiritual regeneration. You have thoughts of thoughts, which is what teenagers are doing, and thoughts of actions, which is what infants are doing. But you can see that thoughts are just one of 3 things. We have, over here, we have love of loving, we have love of thoughts, love of actions. These are the 3 heavens. This is celestial heaven, this is spiritual heaven, and this is the spiritual natural heaven, where people in the spiritual natural heaven are concerned about doing the right actions. They're obedient and want to do the right things, even if they don't have the thoughts to do with them or the love of doing them in the full way, because these are the responsibilities of the heavens above them, which have influx going down into these other ones. And similarly, on the right, the spiritual life is up here in the heavens, the mental life is in the mind, and here we have a physical degree. We have effects from love, which are ends, and so ends or purposes, the things that Roger Bacon took out of science. We can see here there must be something going on here about purposes in the natural. We have effects from thoughts, which are how this influx comes into this degree, and effects from effects. So here we have events and physical events in quantum physics. So I'm extrapolating the idea, the possibility of having 9 degrees, and I put those 9 subdegrees here. And by the way, the Greek word for 9 is ennead, so I call them enneads. We can have trines for 3 and enneads for 9. I'm not sure what language trine is in. Anyone know? No. And so we can then carry on, and we can make an even simpler summary of the same 9 degrees we had on the previous page. I've just labeled them as Swedenborg would label them. And influx goes in those directions. It can go up. It has to go to the right or down or straight down. And so you can have influx from celestial into spiritual, celestial into there, or celestial to there. You can have spiritual influx into there. But Swedenborg says you don't have spiritual influx going straight up, and you don't have spiritual influx going leftwards. There's a different kind of interaction called selection or containment, which works in that direction. But the point is that by extrapolating what I learned, by realizing that these 9 degrees can be understood by Swedenborg, I use this principle to understand that there's an interior mind, which is the first column of 9 degrees. There's the spiritual mind, and then there's an ordinary mind, which is about thinking, and then there's physical degrees. And so we can have formative level, which is to do with ends, virtual processes, which is setting up interactions, and actual results here, which are selections or measurements in quantum physics. And so this is the end of my talk here. It's really to show how on 2 occasions in my earlier life, in my 20s, I took some important ideas from Swedenborg and brought them to understand physics, and then I've gone back and you tried to understand in a better way what Swedenborg was talking about. When he says that love is substance, he doesn't say that in an unambiguous way. He says, you know, God is esse and existere, and love and wisdom. So he's implying that esse is like love and existere, or form, is like wisdom. So I'm using the ideas from Swedenborg, trying to understand what the substance of things are. And then I work back and get a new idea of what the substance of mind and spirit is. I mean, if I read psychologists such as Patricia Churchland, who wrote a book on neurophilosophy a long time ago, she goes on at great length was that against dualism, which the idea is that mind and brain are independent, she keeps on saying, we don't have any idea what mental substance is. And therefore, we have no idea how a mental substance is connected to the brain. But here, we do have an idea of mental substance. And in fact, everyone knows what mental substance is. It's the desires we have. That's our mental substance. Our desires that we have all our life are the mental substance which keep us going. And we can look by influx, which has cause and constraint. We can understand how the mind and brain are connected by using ideas from Swedenborg. Once we make these steps to connect them with discrete degrees and to understand what love is as a kind of substance. And to end with, I'm going to have a plug for my book here. Some of you will have discovered this book outside on the table. I'm selling versions of this. This is a book I wrote in 2011, Starting Science from God. And he says that the principles, principia, are where you start from. So a lot of scientists begin from material hypotheses, but I'm going to start from assuming that there's God according to the way Swedenborg described him, and then work out along the lines I've talked about in this course what are the signs that you might expect on that basis. So there's a website, theisticscience.org, which is earlier, and the book itself, there's more details about it at beginningtheisticscience.org. And I've talked about physics and psychology, which appear in particular chapters there. Okay, so what's the time? We're doing quite well.